Hi, welcome to Truth Sentinel, watching over the truth in the news. Today's date is the 24th of June 2014. Welcome to all listeners, thanks for your support. Currently still here in Ukraine. Sunni rebels in Iraq say they've fully captured the country's main oil refinery in the north of Baghdad. Insurgents led by the group ISIS have overrun a swathe of territory north and west of Baghdad, including Iraq's second biggest city, Mosul. There's also been Israeli airstrikes on Syria, and also a Hamas spokesman in the Gaza Strip said at the weekend that Palestinians were headed towards a direct confrontation with Israel. There's been a big increase in tensions in Iraq, and the Ukraine situation's going on. It seems to me something big is happening in the military. My feeling is that the US and UK governments are planning a nice big war for us all, and it's not going to be pretty. I heard on the grapevine that Obama feels he has no need to get approval for any military action. And I even heard him say in a speech that people need to believe in a supreme power. It sounds to me like the power's going to his head a little. I tweeted Obama this week and invited him onto the show, but he declined to comment, which says everything. Actually, it probably doesn't say much at all, but I guess he's too busy to talk to us. Pro-Russian rebels in eastern Ukraine say they will be observing a ceasefire until Friday morning, responding to Ukrainian forces' unilateral ceasefire, which has also been supported by Putin. This announcement was made in Donetsk by Alexander Borodai, a leader of the Donetsk People's Republic, which is defying Kiev. On Friday, Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko announced a 15-point peace plan and declared a week-long truce. Let's hope this is a sign of peace. I'm a little bit skeptical, but you know, it's never hurts to be positive. The UN has warned of an alarming deterioration in human rights in eastern Ukraine, where separatists are fighting security forces, or at least they were. I think they're still ongoing, although they've sort of said there's a ceasefire, but I don't think it's entirely working at the moment. They found, the UN found serious problems of harassment and persecution of ethnic Tatars in Crimea, which was the mainly ethnic Russian region of Ukraine. Let's just hope the problems here in Ukraine are over. It remains to be seen. I'm going to be leaving in a week or so, but then hope to come back again. So I'll always be keeping an eye on events here. The Queen and Duke of Edinburgh are to visit Northern Ireland later this month, and in fact they're probably on their way at the moment, or almost there. They're going to be attending a series of public engagements, and Northern Ireland Secretary Theresa Villiers said she was absolutely delighted. This will be a wonderful opportunity to show Her Majesty and His Royal Highness around. I mean, I want to make clear, I wish no harm to members of the royal family, but I just do not understand what we're doing with the royal family in this day and age, and why people still refer to them as highnesses and bow and curtsy, handing over millions of pounds every year to buy royal yachts, clothes that never wear twice, have holidays abroad, and every news article is sickeningly glossed over with almost like Stepford Wives kind of love of this family. With the only argument for their purpose being they're good for tourism, which I think is absolute nonsense. I mean, people come to see Buckingham Palace, they never meet the royal family, and if Prince Philip was to get his way, every member of the public would be wiped out like a virus. His words, not mine. Check out his speech on population control, which you can find on YouTube. I'm going to cut down on some of the news this week just so we can go to today's guest. But let's just recap on last episode. We talked to Sarah Bajak again. I talked to Anthony, who's in Ankara, Turkey, and we talked about missing planes and touched on flight MH17 again. An update on what's going on in that case this week. I heard that they're now saying the prime suspect in the disappearance of the jet that was carrying the 230 238 people, or was it 239? I'm not sure. The article I'm reading at the moment says 238, but the flight went off radar on March the 8th, and Captain Zahari Shah, who joined the airline in 1981, is now the most likely suspect. It just seems to me that they're just making stuff up all the time. The family has denied the rumours that Shah was having marital problems, but the police found that Shah had programmed a flight simulator at home to practice a flight far out at sea in the Indian Ocean. Could they be referring to Diego Garcia? And that they admit that he had practiced landing at sea in the Indian Ocean and landing on an island with a short runway. This was reported by the New York Daily News. Police found that the simulator was deleted from the computer on February the 3rd. Now, that being said, shouldn't the possibility of a landing on a small island then be investigated? That's just my thinking. You know, if the guy's been practicing, the plane's disappeared, he's practicing landing on a small island. If you look at the evidence, people should be looking at whether the plane has landed on a small island. Now, if it didn't, then maybe something else happened, but it's at least worth an investigation, surely. Whatever's happened to the plane, I still find that too many things do not add up about this story. Too many constant twists and turns. It's almost becoming a joke now, but not a very funny one, obviously. I hope that there's some progress being made on the appeal for money. Actually, to be honest, the millions that the fund that Sarah was talking about, you know, even if they don't get those millions, I don't think it'll be a wasted exercise, personally. I think just getting people to think about it, still keeping it in the news, getting people to contribute, giving people the opportunity to come forward and say something if they do have any secret information, that's definitely going to be worthwhile. Don't forget to leave comments in the comments section if you've got any ideas on future shows. I mean, a lot of the time, you know, I am helped by people who are suggesting guests and things like Douglas Dietrich, who's our guest today. I know that one of our listeners helped in inspiring him to come on, so thanks for that. And if you have someone that you would like us to talk to, then you could contact them directly. Contact the person, say that they could come and speak to us on Truth Sentinel, and then we can get in touch with them. I came across a video on the net which I've posted on Facebook and Twitter, which is Bill Clinton apologizing for human experiments on people by the CIA. Now, many of these experiments are alleged to have focused on mind control, erasing people's minds, etc. There was court cases over this, so this is not a conspiracy. It's quite incredible that governments would be capable of this. I mean, experiment on people against their will. And it does astound me that despite such cases, which have occurred and historically are a fact, the majority of people still label any suggestion that the government are engaging in criminal acts such as this as conspiracy. It's just stupidity to actually say that when it's already happened, and you've got people like Bill Clinton apologizing for it, which was at least reasonably good of him to do that. There's plenty of information on the internet on what went on with CIA mind control projects, so I'll leave it to listeners to do their own research on that. But maybe my next guest will be able to shed light on both that and other dubious practices that may be occurring in other government institutions such as the military, and he'll be talking about allegations of satanic practices. Douglas Dietrich is my next guest, as I mentioned. Douglas was a Department of Defense research librarian, and Mr. Dietrich was responsible for document destruction. He also became entangled in exposing child sexual abuse scandals. Douglas has appeared as a guest on shows such as Coast to Coast, Caravan to Midnight, and often controversial but never boring. I was delighted to have the chance to speak with him, and I'm going to split the show into two halves because we spoke at quite length. So today's show is part one. We'd originally intended to speak about zombies and vampires, but we talked about other stuff instead. We just sort of decided to see where the conversation would go. We'll talk about zombies and vampires on another show for sure. There is some colourful language in some bits, so I wanted just to warn you. Rather than editing everything out and beeping and stuff that, I just wanted to let you know, and if you know, if you do have children around, you might want to turn the sound down at some point, so that's just a warning. Without further ado, let's listen to what Douglas has to say. Hello, Douglas.
Hi, Mr. Sentinel. I'm really glad to be here with you. It's an honor to be here with your listenership on the Truth Sentinel program.
No, the honour is all ours to have you on as a guest. We really appreciate you taking the time to come and speak to us, because I know you've got a lot of information about lots of different subjects, and I know today we were going to sort of talk about zombies, vampires, and voodoo, but we're also going to cover any other subjects that come up. So, basically, what would you like to talk about first?
Well, I'd like to talk about anything that your audience feels is important, and I think that what is always something that is important to the population in general is a lot of what happens to people that they recognize or people that they're familiar with through media. So that would include celebrities, and I think that in nature of what I specialize in, or if we could dignify it by that term, my manageress is actually someone who has been working with the topic of mind control for a very long time, and supersoldieri is a subtopic of that. So she has organized two summits in a row called Super Soldier Summits 1 and 2. And by the third annual summit that we've held, which was just a few days ago, and it was extremely tied in to what people have been hearing about in the media with the so-called Las Vegas revolution shooters. Basically, that was known as the Mind Control Summit. So we kind of subsumed the topic of supersoldieri within the overarching topic of mind control. I'm going to, of course, allow her to speak to that much more in depth with you when you have her on in the near future. But as for myself, I think that that's a good place to start. I spoke about it just the other day on Joyce Riley's Power Hour, and I put the link to that of the MP3 of that digitally archived audio up on my Facebook timeline. We can bring up a bit about how people can access a lot of things I've done in the past through that and my website as our interview progresses. But one of the things that I think has a lot to do with mind control and what ultimately impacts a lot of these celebrities would be this topic of supersoldieri, what happened in Las Vegas. This does tie in with ultimately what happened to Peaches Geldof. I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly in light of her passing. And she, of course, is someone who's recognized across the Atlantic and a citizen of the United Kingdom when she was alive. One of your country people, if I am to guess your citizenship correctly.
That's right. My oven has suddenly started making a pinging noise. I hope it's okay. I haven't even got anything cooking, so that's very odd, very odd indeed. Never mind. Yeah, Peaches Geldof passed away unfortunately some time ago, and that was quite unexpected. But I mean, these days there are a lot of celebrities that seem to die unexpectedly at a young age, and it always seems to be put down to drugs. They find a bottle of pills next to them. And do you think that's the case?
Well, it's interesting you bring that up. I think that some of these cases are actual suicides, and some of these cases are just drug overdoses or accidents. And by the way, by that I would mean that that the individuals who were victims of that were somehow. Good God, that's maddening! Is there?
Hang on a sec. I'm going to have to try and sort this blooming oven out. I don't know what the hell's happening here. I'm renting an apartment in Odessa, and there's all kinds of machines in this place, and I have no idea how to work the damn things.
Okay, so thank goodness my host was dealing with some electronic harassment all of his own, and he was able to tend to that. And finally, he got some of his machines to cooperate with him, and which is quite the accomplishment on his part, since he doesn't speak any of the local language, at least not to the point yet where he can read the directions of the machinery in Odessa of Ukraine with any great sense of, shall we say, scanning speed. So
that would be correct. Yeah, that would be correct. Luckily, the cooker turned itself off, despite me pressing. I don't think it was anything to do with me pressing all the buttons on the cooker. It just decided to leave me alone after a while.
Well, maybe the way that you stuck your head in it, it's some kind of safety mechanism.
Maybe it did. That could have been it. Yeah.
So with that in mind, we'll turn towards another, or rather a kind of trigger mechanism instead when it comes to the sociology of the United States, and work our way back to Peaches Geldof, who deserves attention. Obviously, what has happened recently in the United States has been the Las Vegas shooting. And that happened in direct concurrence with what my managers had produced, which was the Mind Control Summit. We had gone a bit into the topic of super soldiery, how that phenomena kind of crosses the Atlantic. We'll continue kind of exploring that as the conversation continues. And in terms of what we were dealing with in this particular summit, was that satanic ritual abuse, which ties into the Peaches Geldof case, as well as the concept of super soldiery, electronic harassment, which obviously ties into the Scott Sentinel case that we've just seen, and various other kinds of gang stalking of targeted individuals. All of this ties under the concept of mind control. Now, I myself am stranded in the city of San Francisco. Unless someone is fabulously wealthy, nobody really chooses to live in San Francisco, where more or less the majority of the population is stranded here. If you have rent control, you can barely afford to live here, but you'll never be able to save enough money to move. That's kind of the trap that people in San Francisco are in.
That sounds sounds very similar to London. Then it's almost impossible to survive there, you know.
Yes, yes. I was about to say 3 of the most expensive cities in the world, of course, are well known. They are London, New York City, and Tokyo. But a lot of people forget San Francisco, which actually during certain years, or a good number of years, actually supersedes those 3 major cities in cost, unbelievably. And that goes to show you just how bad it is here, because it's such a small peninsula. It would be about kind of like Manhattan Island in New York City, where everything is stuck together, or downtown London, where everything is just terribly congested. So without going too much into the population demographics of major metropolitan areas, let's going back to what we were saying about San Francisco. The reason I brought that up has an enormous tie to the concept of mind control the development of mind control technologies. And an enormous amount of experimentation went on here for decades during the time of the hippie counterculture, and is still going on to this day. We'll bring up some examples of that as the conversation continues. But what did happen was that I live on what is known as Russian Hill, which used to be obviously a very predominantly Russian district, which is ironic in the sense that, of course, our friend Scott Sentinel is over in the predominantly Russian-speaking area of Odessa right now. And we have a small Russian cemetery on top of which all of the residences were built. And it was in this area that I had a neighbor, I use the term had quite poignantly, named Ryan Kelly Chamberlain II. And Ryan Kelly Chamberlain II was someone who I would see all the time. He was very hard to miss. He was about 6 foot 3 inches tall, and about probably around about 250 pounds. So big guy, and never got to know him, of course, or speak to him, because that's what happens in a major city. Everybody goes about their business. There's no real time to talk to each other most of the time. And when I took off to the Mind Control Summit for the weekend of the 30th through the 31st of May, going into the 1st of this month, the 1st of June, this weekend that transferred us from one month into another, was the time of our 3-day Mind Control Summit in Las Vegas. Now, while I was in Las Vegas, the day that I left, apparently, the very next day, the very next morning, not apparently, but shall we say catastrophically for the individuals involved, the FBI raided my next door domicile, which was the home of Ryan Kelly Chamberlain II, and they basically cordoned off all of Russian Hill, which is between Chinatown and North Beach in San Francisco. They sealed it down, shut it down as a potential disaster area on the basis of the housing in the residence next door to mine. So they claimed of weapons of mass destruction. They brought in a nuclear emergency search team, acronymed NEST, N-E-S-T, and they brought in the biohazard teams, literally men in moon suits. And they claimed that there was radiological materials for the construction of dirty bombs. They claimed that there were ricin, a number of other mass destructive poisons. They busted into this guy's home, tore it all apart, and put out a national all-points bulletin for this individual. In other words, they organized a national manhunt on the spot. National, just throughout all the 50 states, looking for this guy. And they captured him within, obviously, about hours. He was in a bar, the Mad Dog in the Fog bar in Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco, which is a renowned hippie counterculture area from the 60s, later on a skinhead area, and now just kind of like a crash and burnout area. But he was there drinking, he had no concept he was in the news, had no idea what was going on, and they took him down and took him to the San Francisco Hall of Justice. He will go inside of the federal penitentiary system, and you will never hear of this individual again.
What's he charged with then?
Basically, as I said originally when I brought up all the charges, they charged him with everything you could think of. I mean, they were bringing in biohazard teams, they were bringing in the nuke teams, they were bringing, basically they were saying he was like a regular Saddam Hussein, that he had weapons of mass destruction, WMDs up the ass, and that this guy was manufacturing them in his home, purifying ricin, taking industrial grade nuclear materials and manufacturing bombs. And of course, with that, they could seal off all the media, and they did so. And since the time that they evacuated him, they came out with basically they found absolutely nothing of any substance whatsoever. They are bringing up the most ridiculous things imaginable. Basically, they had informed the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and the Department of Homeland Security that he had accumulated all this evil stuff. But in the end, what they are talking about was that they found ground rosary peas. Ground rosary peas, which you can grow in your backyard. The plant from which abrin is processed. Now, abrin, of course, is potentially deadly. But abrin is something that would require industrial level laboratories to process from your ground rosary peas. So that's what they've got him on. He will spend the rest of his life rotting in jail with that. He will be entirely separated from media, very similar to the partner of the man who blew up Oklahoma City's federal building, Timothy McVeigh's partner, Terry Nichols. Has absolutely no access to media. It will be the same with this poor bastard. And what he is truly guilty of is being next door neighbor to a major whistleblower, which is myself. And since that period of time, they've been totally deconstructing the interior of his domicile, stripping its walls, and installing just a ton of surveillance equipment, which is painfully obvious. They're bringing it in through the front and back doors. And I can see both doors because I'm his next door neighbor. And they're bringing in any number of scanners and audio recorders, all the rest of that. And they're just plastering it up against his wall directly facing my rooms. That's basically what happened while I was gone. But the work in which they've deconstructed and re-equipped his facility has been going on since I returned.
So they might be listening to the show then.
Well, but that's part of the idiocy, right? I mean, they could so easily listen to it, but I guess they want to listen to it, in advance, before it gets edited, before it gets, basically put up on the digital archives, so that they can be a step ahead of the game if we have any plans to, make you the next president of Ukraine or something.
I don't think that's going to happen in a hurry.
Well, hey, aren't you the man behind the Darth Vader mask?
No, I mean, the guy they've got in charge now, Poroshenko. I mean, he seems almost half decent in comparison to some previous Ukrainian presidents. At least he makes good chocolate. That's what I'd say. I mean, he makes. He's the owner of the Lorien chocolate business, and I've tried the chocolate. It's fantastic.
That's great. Well, by the way, Mr. Sentinel, sukolat, by the way, is the Russian word for it, I believe. One of the things that you can do so that I don't look like I'm spouting non sequiturs, you can confirm to our listenership that there is a man who was part of the Jedi Party or the Sith Party who is running for president of Ukraine, was at the time of the election.
Yeah, I seem to remember hearing something like that, yeah.
Yeah, well, we saw photos of him over here in the West. He was the most recognized candidate in the West, let's say that. Mm-hmm. I'm sure he was quite peripheral and nothing more than a novelty where you're at in the place where he was running. But, yeah, at any rate, so in terms of going back to how all of this connects, while we were holding the summit, we had a number of experiencers that were relating their personal experiences with the electronic harassment, the destruction, the dismantling, the deconstruction of their lives, their very sense of reality, by what was, in the end, one could only conclude to be some tremendously funded social experiment on the part of the United States government. Now, all anyone needs to do is look up the LSD psychedelic experiments as conducted by the CIA back in the 1960s and 70s. In the majority, they were conducted right here in San Francisco, where I live, and one can get a hint of some of what was going down at the time in terms of destroying people's sense of reality, destroying their lives. The government is on record as having done this.
Yeah, I think I saw a video the other day of Bill Clinton apologizing for some of these mind control experiments they did on people. Didn't they literally sometimes just drag people off the street and do mind control experiments on them?
Yes, this is true. And what you're speaking of, by the way, was Clinton's organization of a presidential investigation into what was originally radiation experiments. So if people look up the radiation experiments and the government, the federal report on the results of what the department, what used to be known as the Atomic Energy Commission, the AEC, and it became later on the I believe it's called the Department of Energy now, or the DOE. But that is the successor department because the Atomic Energy Commission became so infamous for doing exactly what you've just articulated that people were going to rise up in revolt. And the American government headed it off at the pass by dismantling the agency and introducing a new one to take its place that was supposedly reformed. Now, with the dismantling of the old agency, the government burned and destroyed all of those records. So whatever they could find survived by accident, as documents are wont to do, and they were leaked by whistleblowers such as myself over the years. I did indeed leak a number of those Atomic Energy Commission experiments because they were conducted in conjunction with stellar universities such as the University of Rochester in New York, UCSF, or the University of California at San Francisco, here in the Greater Bay Area, and of course all of this was done in cooperation with Letterman Army Medical Center, where 25% of the military doctors in the United States Army were trained. And that closed, of course, along with the military base in 1995, but LAMC, or Letterman Army Medical Center, was participating in getting the results from UCSF, which was testing radioactive, which was basically injecting or aerosolizing radioactive materials and placing them into confined prison areas, into public areas. It was just, it's obscene. But these aren't just like, shall we say, universities that are in Podunk or someplace like that. These are universities with major equipment and major government funding for research. So all of this is something that President Clinton quite rightly apologized for, and in that regard, it makes him, in my opinion, for that alone at least, he has to be admired as one of the better presidents. If for nothing else, as ridiculous as his behavior was, I think it was far more comedic than it was shall we say, provocative of a sense of horror, like you get with so many other executive heads of state in the United States.
And didn't they give compensation to some of the people involved in those experiments?
Oh, but it was so worthless. I mean, how can you compensate for something like that? The majority of the people were dead. They obviously died because they were injecting them with extremely deadly radioactive materials into their system. They were also extremely deadly chemicals. Overdoses of LSD will fry your brains to the point where they can give you all the money in the world. You won't know how to spend it.
And this was all against their will as well. I mean, they didn't actually comply with this, right?
Of course. Well, it was not against. The better way to say it, you would be against their will if they had known about it and were forced to do it against their consent. It was done without their knowing. This was done without their even knowing it was being done. To give you examples of this, they would take radioactive isotopes and they would place them into the breakfast cereal of retarded children who were in special care facilities.
That's unbelievable, isn't it? It's like, if that's true, and I've no reason to doubt
it's true.
it is.
That was
I mean, I think that's partly what Bill Clinton was apologizing for. But people forget these things, don't they? They still a lot of people do trust the government, and they forget these things that have happened in the past. It always amazes me that people are so quick to forget when these cases are actually in the open now.
Yes, well, the reason for that is, in a sense, it's quite simple. It's not even so much forgetfulness. If you speak to the majority of people in the United States, there is a tremendous cynicism and a tremendous distrust of the government. The asininity, the true insanity in the United States, the pathology emerges when, of course, you try to stir them to some means of actual commitment to learning what's going on behind the dynamics of why they don't trust the government. People have an inherent distrust, but they don't want to know why, because the reality of what the government is doing is so painful that your average person, when confronted with what the government has done to them, to their generations before them, what the government's been doing for decades since the onset of the Second World War, the majority of people would have to put up or shut up. They would have to face the moral choice of, I can no longer pay taxes to this government. Or they would have to say, I have to pick up a gun and rebel violently. I can no longer consider myself a citizen of this criminal enterprise. So when faced with that kind of choice, one can say, who can blame them, that they sink instead back into apathy and really take a position of, I don't want to know. Now, what makes it all so repulsive, and what needs to be taken into account, is that ultimately, of course, whatever a government does, ultimately, it's the population that supports that government with taxes that is responsible. And the difference between what went on in the Third Reich and what went on in the United States is that in the time of the Third Reich, which is something that the Americans always present as, and the Russians do too, as this ultimate epitome of evil, though the Russians are far more realistic about it, especially when they are more accepting of the horrors of the Soviet totalitarian system than Americans are of the horrors of their so-called democratic system. But in terms of what happens in the United States, you've got this population that points their fingers at the Third Reich all the time by saying our government is becoming more Nazi-like. And what makes it so absurd, of course, is that if our government were truly run by Nazis who had come over from across the Atlantic and reorganized the American system, the trains would run on time. There would be no phenomenon of homelessness because all those people would be committed to camps. There would be no phenomena of this kind of, shall we say, unemployment because everyone would be mobilized to work in the armaments industry. And we wouldn't have less than 1% of our population in the military because we would be a militarized society. We wouldn't have this enormous problem of giant ghettos of ethnically enclaved populations all over the United States because the United States would be racially segregated. There are so many obvious things into what a National Socialist government, a Nazi government, would do in the United States, but everyone keeps pointing their fingers at this nebulous Nazification of the United States. The reality is it is a purely American phenomena in terms of the evil that has been engendered by American culture itself. And the difference primarily between the United States and the Third Reich was that the National Socialistische government, the NSDAP, or the National Socialistische Deutsches Arbeiterpartei, the Labor Party of the German peoples, it was that they were literally voted in legally. They were 10% of the population. And it never really expanded beyond that. Though one had to be realistically a member of the party in order to advance in terms of any real paying profession or a profession with great benefits and rewards. Obviously, one had to be a member of the party to succeed in that regard. But nevertheless, despite all of that, the reality was that there was never more than 10% of the German population that was ever card-carrying members of the NSDAP, or the Nazi Party. And of those 10, of that party itself, only 10% were Schutzstaffel, or SS, and of that, only 10% were Waffen-SS, or weaponized SS, serving in the fields, and of that, only 10% were Totenkopfverbände, or the concentration camp guards, the Death's Head units, which were also deployed for combat. And so we have this phenomenon, and of those, by the way, the Totenkopfverbände, SSTV, of those only 10% were actual scientific, experimental doctors who were researching the genetics of the human differences in race, differences in twinning, as was a specialty of Dr. Mengele, and Dr. Joseph Mengele, who has become the infamous angel of death, or the personification of Nazism. You're talking about 10% of 10% of 10% of 10%. Now, in the United States, on the other hand, everyone is either an independent party, more and more people libertarian, but the majority of people are still Republican or Democrat, and either government has been responsible for heinous atrocities, and as you say, in full light of the American public. Unlike the Third Reich, where the reality was the Konzentrationslager, or the concentration camps, were not public. They were part of a covert operation. And the majority of them were outside of Deutschland, or outside of Germany. So you've got the situation where the reality was the average German person, honestly, did not know what was going on in terms of Die Endlösung, or the final solution, what has come down to us in popular culture as the Holocaust.
Douglas, I just wanted to ask you about the Nazis and Operation Paperclip. You know, a lot of people say that there was some relocations of some of these people that were doing the experiments. Do you know how much truth there is in that?
Oh, there's an enormous amount of truth, but you have to remember, bringing scientists over as technical advisors is not transferring a government to administer your nation's state. Werner von Braun came to the United States, and his brother Magnus von Braun, went to the Soviet Union. Now, the fact that this is unknown to anybody is beyond me, but it happens to be a fact. Both of them, more than anything else, served to misdirect and sabotage the rival space programs of the United States and the Soviet Union, because if they had truly put their all and efforts behind it, we would be established at the very least on the Moon and Mars with colonies by now. But in reality, Werner von Braun always said, you know, my brother was the lucky one, because his brother at least got to work with a very serious totalitarian state that had the busiest cosmodromes in the world. All of the space programs depend on Russian uplift at this point in history, the remnants of the Soviet space program, and the Soviets, of course, have stated that when America's contract runs out, they're not going to fly Americans to the International Space Station anymore. And since everyone counts on Russian transport to get to the ISS, that means it's going to turn into a purely Russian space station. So, in terms of America's space efforts, it all died. The Americans had no intention of doing anything.
Yeah, I always wondered why there wasn't so many trips to the moon after the 70s, the early 70s. I think they stopped then, and then there didn't seem to be any more trips after that. And I always wondered what was going on up there.
Well, there was a multiple amount of factors. In terms of what happened with the moon, what people tend to think of, we speak about the occult in the elite paradigm. This is something that I think cannot be overemphasized. As a citizen of the United Kingdom yourself, you are probably painfully aware of the undercurrent of occult investigation that has always been part of the upper class. And one of the manifestations of this was the Hellfire Club. And the Hellfire Club, of course, was quite real, is still quite real, but nowhere near at the level of power brokering that it was at the time of the height of the British Empire. But a lot of this started off with Queen Elizabeth and her obsession with the occult and her relationship that she had with Mr. D. And John D, of course, was the original 007. That was how he signed himself, a 00 and a 7. And John D was the last officially recognized royal sorcerer. And as the royal sorcerer, he was credited with raising the storm that sank the Spanish Armada. Now, there's no denying the fact that he used scrying with his Irish assistant to identify a Spanish plot that was in the British Isles at the time to burn the forests of the British Isles and therefore prevent the ability of the British to raise a fleet or construct one. So by stymieing that plot in terms of massive sabotage, he proved his worth as an intelligence officer and established one of the world's first intelligence agencies, probably the world's first Western intelligence agency. Now, his success in this regard combined the science of the occult, or the study of the occult, with the science of intelligence. And they've been really inseparable ever since. So with the British, they developed a military occult complex, and this was aped, if you will, by the Americans. But the British, of course, John Dee was never a Satanist. Later on, there was that taint of Satanism that began to infect the British upper class. That's where the Hellfire Club came in. So you had, at that time, when the British ruled India, you had an enormous amount of sacrifice that was going on of millions of Indians. Now, how on earth would this happen? What on earth am I talking about? Well, people can look this up themselves on a search engine, do their own research. The British are most famous in their cloudy little island for wonderful hedgerows and magnificent gardens, which shows how good they are at this because they're in a climate which is hardly conducive to such. So the fact that the British were able to raise these hedgerows made them consummate botanists. And when they went down to India, the British Raj discovered that British hedgerows in the equatorial tropical climate of India mutated and became monstrous thorn brushes that could be turned into a form of wall. And as a matter of fact, they did what later on the Germans emulated in the Bocage country of France after D-Day. One of the things that Irvin the Royal Mail did was he set up an enormous network of in-depth defense in the French Bocage country, which became known to the Americans as Hedgerow Hell. He hollowed out all of the thorn bushes within the Bocage area of France, and within these hollowed out thorn bushes, which were quite angular in nature, they were established snipers' posts, mortar batteries, and various other in-depth defenses, machine gun nests, that tore the Americans apart. Far more Americans died in the Bocage country than died at D-Day. And far more suffered psychological breakdowns from the constant attacks from all sides, the need to investigate every single bush, and they finally attached giant forklifts to their tanks to just roll over the hedgerows and whatever was inside of them. Now, the British went far beyond that, and during the rule of the Raj, they established a giant hedgerow network that mutated into what became known as the Great British Wall of India. They divided India into 4 quarters, well, literally crucified the entire subcontinent with a wall going from north to south and a wall going from east to west, and they were able to divvy up and decide who lived, who died, who got food distributed, and when any area was in rebellion, who starved to death, who didn't get medical supplies. Because of their policies worked around this wall, millions of Asian Indians died. Well, many people interpreted this, as in India, quite correctly, as a massive sacrifice to very negative entities that fed off that kind of human suffering. And this traced back to the Hellfire Club. The majority of members of the upper class of Britain were members of this Hellfire Club. And they were learning all of the dark arts of Indian yoga and Kundalini in the most negative sense, and channeling a lot of this energy using the energy of the human sacrifices that were ongoing in India. This is a Holocaust of monumental proportions. Far more people died under British rule in India than ever died under the rule of the Third Reich. Of course, British are never educated in it, but if any Britisher starts investigating the Great Wall, the Great Hedge of India, they will find out everything I am saying is true.
And what about the Hellfire Club? Is that still continuing to this day?
It still is. As I said, they're not the power brokers that they once were, and I'll tell you why. Because the Americans took over the field. To give you an example of this, I was assigned liaison status to the officially recognized Satanic Chaplain of the United States Army for nearly a decade. I was a Department of Defense research librarian. I worked at El Presidio Real de San Francisco. The individual who was also stationed there was Colonel Michael Aquino. Now, Colonel Michael Angelo Aquino was able to retire as a colonel. He was, in a sense, forced into retirement after a number of hellish scandals at the Presidio military base, which we'll get into in a moment should you have the stomach to listen to it. Well, I'll just summarize them briefly. They had to do with child molestation. What had happened in the Presidio military base was that in the 1980s, when I was working at Presidio, the United States had a global empire that it had stolen from the British and everyone else that it could steal from. And all over this empire, it had established military bases, many that don't exist anymore. There were bases in West Germany, there were bases in South Korea, Okinawa, the Philippines. Now, the United States has been forced to withdraw from Germany. Whatever is maintained in Germany is simply hospitals that are in cooperation with the German government. The United States has not occupied Germany for many, many years, decades, as a matter of fact. And I bring that up pointedly because so many people in America are so ehistorate. That's the historical version of illiterate. They're so ehistorate, they have no idea that the Berlin Wall has fallen down. that Germany kicked the Americans out. This is how Americans are. They have no connection with reality. But at any rate, in terms of what happened with all of these military bases, they had all kinds of workers who were not just soldiers in uniform, but DoD bureaucrats with wives, children, officers with wives and children, and they all needed daycare centers. So one thing I'm sure you and I can agree on, or anybody with any sense of rationality can agree on, whatever a military should be, the one thing a military should never be is a family environment. Well, at the time in the 80s, when I was working as a DoD bureaucrat, a research librarian in liaison with Colonel Michael Aquino, the Army's officially recognized Satanic Chaplain, at that time, the United States Army was caring for 100,000 children a day worldwide. 100,000 children every day worldwide were in its daycare centers. Now, literally, 1,000 of these kids, 500, were at the Presidio military base of San Francisco in one of their largest daycare centers. Now, it turned out my high school teacher, Gary Willard Hambright, who taught at the vocational institute that I went to school at, he was federally indicted by a federal grand jury for the sexual assault of no less than 14 children, all of them under 4 years of age, because he managed the Presidio Daycare Center. Now, if he had not died of AIDS while he was on trial, he would have been indicted for hundreds more assaults. And he was responsible, it was calculated, for infecting around 500,000 kids with AIDS. And at that period in time, there was no internet as we know it today. The internet was developed by DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And because of what happened at the Presidio military base, they stalled the public release of the internet as a technology for half a decade. And very few people had access to any kind of internet as we would understand it today. One of the original companies that provided information electronically was a company known as Electricity, spelled with an I at the end instead of a Y, here in San Francisco. Now, they were releasing electronically all kinds of information about Lieutenant Colonel, at that time it was the Lieutenant Colonel, Michael Aquino, being accused of raping these kids along with my high school teacher, Gary Willard Hambright. And as a result, he sued Electricity. It went all the way up to the San Francisco General Court, and he lost. He also sued the U.S. Army to take his name off of the CID, the Criminal Investigations Division of the United States Army, to take his name off the CID list of child molestation suspects. He sued the Army, and he lost. And one of the reasons why he lost both lawsuits was because the children described him physically to the exact degree. And they said, this man sexually raped me. And they described his home, and when his home was raided by Inspector Pamphloff of the San Francisco Police Department, they went inside his home, and the home was exactly as the children described it. Now, this guy never spent a day in jail. Neither did Gary Willard Hambright, my vocational instructor, who would have spent the rest of his life in jail, but he died of AIDS. Now, this is all part of the Super Soldier program. Now, what does this mean? How could that be? What kind of super soldiery does this have to do with? Well, there was a lot of experimentation. This is something to know about Colonel Michael Aquino. Colonel Michael Aquino was a psychological warfare expert. He worked with PSYOPs, the chaplaincy of Satanism that he was recognized for in the Army was his secondary responsibility. He was actually an intelligence analyst specialist who specialized in PSYOPs that combined the occult on the same basis that John Dee combined the occult in service to his queen. Now, one of the things that Colonel Michael Aquino explained to me was the fact, and this is reality, people who investigate his background can vet everything I'm saying. His background is quite public because the individual was put on a number of trials, as I've just described, and all of this was made public. It is a public record. Now, also a public record was the fact that he had international security clearances. He was on second mint to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, of which the United Kingdom and the United States are primary members. He also was a member of the WAC, the World Affairs Council. So as a result, he had international security clearances, and this is why you've got many so-called super soldiers who are really super victims of child molestation. You have super soldiers like the British citizen Max Spears, last name spelled S-P-I-E-R-S. Max Spears is a Britisher who's in England right now, and he has solid memories of running into Michael Aquino, who was essentially cultivating him and indoctrinating him. So you're talking about people who remember Michael Aquino both sides of the Atlantic. As a matter of fact, one of the things he's most notorious for is a satanic ritual conducted in the SS castle of Wewelsburg in Germany in the 1980s. What most people don't understand is that Satanism and National Socialism are two very different phenomena. The National Socialistisch were a combination of what you would call Nordism or evangelical Nordicism, a Nordic paganism, and a combination of Christian Gnosticism, or heretical Christianity that was based on gnosis, or intimate knowledge, or communion with divinities, as opposed to pistis, or faith, which would be the basis of Christian churches. So the Gnostics produced various heretical movements, such as the Cathars in France, whom the Roman Catholic Church ordered a crusade against and exterminated. Now, the National Socialists came more of that tradition of intimate communion in a pagan sense with the Viking gods of the Norse, and bringing that into the 20th century and the 3rd millennium. That has nothing to do with Satanism. Satanism, of course, was very threatened by this revivalism of paganism, which is occurring all over Europe. There is more of a sense of Slavonic paganism, of Nordic paganism. Europe now is edging out of Christianity and returning to its spiritual indigenous roots, whereas the Satanists are trying to overwhelm the United States through ritual abuse and control of the media. Now, one of the things that Colonel Michael Aquino was assigned to do as a NATO officer was to go into Wewelsburg Castle, which was established by Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer of the Schutzstaffel of the SS, and conduct a suppression ritual in which he conducted an inversion ritual to try and keep the spirit of the Old Norse gods at bay for at least another decade or two, so that Satanism would get the upper hand to triumph in the Western world. And people can look up this ritual that he did at Wewelsburg Castle. It is, again, a matter of public record. He was finally evicted, or ejected, if you will, from Germany because the National Socialists, both the Old Guard and the neo-Nazi skinheads, rallied together and pointed out to the Bundesrepublik Deutschland, or the Federal Republic of German government, that he was basically committing sacrilege and desecrating a national monument.
Can I ask, what actually was the ritual that he was doing then?
The ritual that he was conducting was, as I said, an inversion ritual, a suppression ritual. If I went into the details of that, it would take hours. I would confess I don't remember them consciously. I would literally have to look through my notes. But in terms of the point of the ritual, that is something that you can take to the bank. What else would he be doing in there as a Satanist? He has no communion with the old pagan Norse gods. So it's not his religion that he was operating in the name of. He was operating in the name of the religion of the military junta of the United States. One of the things that he had explained to me was the fact that just as the old original culture of the Greeks, the Spartans, the Macedonians, the Hellenic world had cultivated a pantheon of powerful deities and divinities, gods that were interacting with every moment of their lives. And just as the Greeks were able to commune with these gods, the best thing to read about this would be the breakdown of the bicameral mind by Julian Jaynes. That book basically talks about the birth of consciousness as we understand it today, and the shriveling up, or the vestigialism, of our ability to directly commune with divine voices that people would hear all the time, all the way up to Joan of Arc. Now, the Greeks would hear these all the time and feel that they were in communion with the gods. Now, this is what is known as gnosis. This is what the Nazis were into, or the National Socialists as neo-pagans. Now, in terms of the Hellenic world, they were ultimately absorbed by the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire was basically an unimaginative, acculturated, that means non-cultural, garrison state. They were just basically a military police state that had developed no culture of its own of any consequence other than that of militarization. And as a result, having no creativity and no sense of real culture, they stole, literally appropriated, all of the gods of ancient Greece. And they made them their own. Aphrodite became Venus, Ares became Mars, Jove became Zeus, or Zeus became Jove, excuse me. And the Americans, as Colonel Michael Aquino had explained to me, had stolen the devils of Greater Britain. And that was why the British Empire had died and withered up on the vine so quickly, that the British Empire under Bomber Harris was making one last desperate attempt with the nighttime bombing to make so many human sacrifices at Dresden and other major German cities, which they turned into open-air infernos. Firestorms were generated that burned everybody alive. as surely as any dead Jewish body that was thrown into the incinerators at Auschwitz. Now, all of this was done under bomber Harris so they could create as many sacrifices for their devils as possible so that the Hellfire Club could continue into the 21st century. Well, they lost that contest. The Americans were able to kill more. And when the Americans were able to feed these devils more, the devils came to them.
I was going to ask you, so are you saying that basically the army are using Satanism and sorcery as a kind of form of warfare?
Absolutely. And this is the occult paradigm on which the government of the United States operates. This is where the occult and the elite operate on a paradigm that no normal human being understands. I'll give you an example of this. When you talk about money, you and I would say, Scott Sentinel and Douglas Dietrich would get together and say, "Hey, you got any money? I'm out." And of course, Scott would say, "No, man, I'm bumming for money myself." Because Scott Sentinel and Douglas Dietrich are both dirt poor.
That's pretty true, actually.
Yeah, yeah. That's why. By the way, that's why Scott Sentinel's in the Ukraine. That's the only place he can afford to buy a lunch.
It's true. I had to flee London. I just couldn't afford it anymore. Sandwiches are about a third of the price over here.
He can finally feed himself now. I understand he's actually gained enough weight where he's considering jogging.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, maybe I should go back to London and I can starve myself a bit more.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, that would force you. Yeah, you'd probably lose about 10 pounds during the first month you were there.
Probably would. Yeah, I'll be able to get off the cabbage soup diet, which I'm on at the moment. So let me know what you think of what Douglas said so far, and there's more to come in our next episode. Remember, we welcome listeners as well as guest speakers on this show, so if you want to come on anytime, say hello, or you want to talk about a certain subject or respond to things you've heard on the show, drop us an email at scottsentinel9@gmail.com, and we'll see if we can get you on via Skype. Don't forget to come and say hi on our other social media such as Facebook and Twitter. Normally if you do a search for Scott Sentinel 9 or just Truth Sentinel, you should come up with our various pages. Topics coming up in future episodes could include super soldiers, mysterious celebrity deaths, planned obsolescence, patterns in world events, the Dyatlov Pass incident and religious cults. This is the section where we talk about economic markets, sports, space and weather, natural events, any of those topics that catch my eye. I'm not going to talk too much about that this week, but I thought I'd just mention a little bit about Fukushima, which comes under natural disasters, but it's far from being a natural event. I mean, thyroid cancer rates are 40 times higher than normal according to some sources. And Fukushima was an area where I used to live for a number of years, and I know one person where I work got cancer, and other people got tumours. Cancer rates across the world are on an increase, and it doesn't seem to me that enough people are investigating the real cause, not only about Fukushima, but just generally across the world. I mean, I think personally that some of this has to have been caused by nuclear testing that's occurred since the 40s. You can watch that video that I've mentioned before of over 1,000 nuclear weapons that have been detonated in various parts of the world since the 40s. Now, there's just the possibility that this is some kind of population control scenario, reducing the population, as is kind of inferred by the Georgia Guidestones that I've also mentioned on the show before. A bit like a frog being slowly boiled without noticing until it's too late. What if we're all being affected by radiation, and that it's designed to cut down the population? I mean, that is paranoia spreading, but I thought I'd just put that out there. I wouldn't be the first person to say that. It does seem to me that there is no real desire by governments to find a cure for cancer. If one was found, and there are those that allege that there have been cures for cancer found, it would be crushed under a mountain of bureaucracy, pharmaceutical control, so it would never actually be made available to the public. Just something to think about. It's all very cheery, I know. Remember, blind belief in authority is the greatest enemy of truth. Albert Einstein said that. We are about spreading of tolerance, looking for peaceful yet revolutionary change on Truth Sentinel, trying to make a better society, which we don't think is happening with our current system of government, and we believe that it's it's good to talk about it, try to change people's mentality to talk about mistrust of the government and find a better way. Just get everyone to start talking about it. We don't have to have a revolution with violence. If we all just basically start to realize that something's wrong, which it obviously is, then maybe we can do something about it by initially just accepting that's what's happening. To wind down, some positive news. The Sudanese woman I mentioned in a previous show who was sentenced to death for abandoning her Islamic faith has been freed from jail, her lawyer has told the BBC. Miriam Ibrahim's death penalty was overturned by an appeal court, the official Suna news agency reported. She's married to a Christian man and was sentenced under Sharia law to hang for apostasy, which is denying your faith, in May, basically. Her husband, Daniel Wani, said he was looking forward to seeing her. Now, under Sharia law, you cannot deny your faith. I mean, in some forms of Islam, such as in Saudi Arabia. Anyway, finally, maybe some happier news. There's a new winner of the world's ugliest dog contest. His name was Peanut, and if you type into Google Peanut, world's ugliest dog, you will see quite an ugly dog. He does deserve the prize, that's all I'm going to say, so if you get a chance, have a look at him. He's 2 years old, and he won the World's Ugliest Dog show at the 26th annual competition held in Petaluma, California. Remember, we're always looking for sponsors, advertisers, people who'd like to help finance this show. Please contact us. We're also looking for people to help us, guests or researchers, or especially people who can help to get more exposure for the program by posting links. Please share our show. Unlike some shows, we want as many people as possible to listen. Thanks again for listening, and catch you later. Goodbye. Maybe something else happened, but it's at least worth an investigation, surely. Whatever's happened to the plane, I still find that too many things do not add up about this story. Too many constant twists and turns. It's almost becoming a joke now, but not a very funny one, obviously. I hope that there's some progress being made on the appeal for money. Actually, to be honest, the millions that the fund that Sarah was talking about, you know, even if they don't get those millions, I don't think it'll be a wasted exercise, personally. I think just getting people to think about it, still keeping it in the news, getting people to contribute, giving people the opportunity to come forward and say something if they do have any secret information, that's definitely going to be worthwhile. Don't forget to leave comments in the comments section if you've got any ideas on future shows. I mean, a lot of the time, you know, I am helped by people who are suggesting guests and things like Douglas Dietrich, who's our guest today. I know that one of our listeners helped in inspiring him to come on, so thanks for that. And if you have someone that you would like us to talk to, then you could contact them directly. Contact the person, say that they could come and speak to us on Truth Sentinel, and then we can get in touch with them. I came across a video on the net which I've posted on Facebook and Twitter, which is Bill Clinton apologizing for human experiments on people by the CIA. Now, many of these experiments are alleged to have focused on mind control, erasing people's minds, etc. There was court cases over this, so this is not a conspiracy. It's quite incredible that governments would be capable of this. I mean, experiment on people against their will. And it does astound me that despite such cases, which have occurred and historically are a fact, the majority of people still label any suggestion that the government are engaging in criminal acts such as this as conspiracy. It's just stupidity to actually say that when it's Hi, welcome to Truth Sentinel, watching over the truth in the news. Today's date is the 24th of June 2014. Welcome to all listeners, thanks for your support. Currently still here in Ukraine. Sunni rebels in Iraq say they've fully captured the country's main oil refinery in the north of Baghdad. Insurgents led by the group ISIS have overrun a swathe of territory north and west of Baghdad, including Iraq's second biggest city, Mosul. There's also been Israeli airstrikes on Syria, and also a Hamas spokesman in the Gaza Strip said at the weekend that Palestinians were headed towards a direct confrontation with Israel. There's been a big increase in tensions in Iraq, and the Ukraine situation's going on. It seems to me something big is happening in the military. My feeling is that the US and UK governments are planning a nice big war for us all, and it's not going to be pretty. I heard on the grapevine that Obama feels he has no need to get approval for any military action. And I even heard him say in a speech that people need to believe in a supreme power. Sounds to me like the power's going to his head a little. I tweeted Obama this week and invited him onto the show, but he declined to comment, which says everything. Actually, it probably doesn't say much at all, but I guess he's too busy to talk to us. Pro-Russian rebels in eastern Ukraine say they will be observing a ceasefire until Friday morning, responding to Ukrainian forces' unilateral ceasefire, which has also been supported by Putin. This announcement was made in Donetsk by the argument for their purpose being they're good for tourism, which I think is absolute nonsense. I mean, people come to see Buckingham Palace, they never meet the royal family. And if Prince Philip was to get his way, every member of the public would be wiped out like a virus. His words, not mine. Check out his speech on population control, which you can find on YouTube. I'm going to cut down on some of the news this week, just so we can go to today's guest. But let's just recap on last episode. We talked to Sarah Bajak again. I talked to Anthony, who's in Ankara, Turkey, and we talked about missing planes and touched on flight MH17 again. An update on what's going on in that case this week. I heard that they're now saying the prime suspect in the disappearance of the jet that was carrying the 238 people, or was it 239? I'm not sure. The article I'm reading at the moment says 238, but the flight went off radar on March the 8th, and Captain Zahari Shah, who joined the airline in 1981, is now the most likely suspect. It just seems to me that they're just making stuff up all the time. The family has denied the rumours that Shah was having marital problems, but the police found that Shah had programmed a flight simulator at home to practice a flight far out at sea in the Indian Ocean. Could they be referring to Diego Garcia? And that they admit that he had practiced landing at sea in the Indian Ocean and landing on an island with a short runway. This was reported by the New York Daily News. Police found that the simulator was deleted from the computer on February the 3rd. Now, that being said, shouldn't the possibility of a landing on a small island then be investigated? That's just my thinking. You know, if the guy's been practicing, the plane's disappeared, he's practicing landing on a small island. If you look at the evidence, people should be looking at whether the plane is landed on a small island. Now, if it didn't, then Alexander Borodai, a leader of the Donetsk People's Republic, which is defying Kiev. On Friday, Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko announced a 15-point peace plan and declared a week-long truce. Let's hope this is a sign of peace. I'm a little bit skeptical, but you know, it's never hurts to be positive. The UN has warned of an alarming deterioration in human rights in eastern Ukraine, where separatists are fighting security forces, or at least they were. I think they're still ongoing, although they've sort of said there's a ceasefire, but I don't think it's entirely working at the moment. They found, the UN found serious problems of harassment and persecution of ethnic Tatars in Crimea, which was the mainly ethnic Russian region of Ukraine. Let's just hope that the problems here in Ukraine are over. It remains to be seen. I'm going to be leaving in a week or so, but then hope to come back again. So I'll always be keeping an eye on events here. The Queen and Duke of Edinburgh are to visit Northern Ireland later this month, and in fact they're probably on their way at the moment, or almost there. They're going to be attending a series of public engagements, and Northern Ireland Secretary Theresa Villiers said she was absolutely delighted. This will be a wonderful opportunity to show Her Majesty and His Royal Highness around. I mean, I want to make clear, I wish no harm to members of the royal family, but I just do not understand what we're doing with the royal family in this day and age, and why people still refer to them as highnesses and bow and curtsy, handing over millions of pounds every year to buy royal yachts, clothes that never wear twice, have holidays abroad, and every news article is sickeningly glossed over with almost like Stepford Wives kind of love of this family. Well, the it's already happened, and you've got people like Bill Clinton apologising for it, which was at least reasonably good of him to do that. There's plenty of information on the internet on what went on with CIA mind control projects, so I'll leave it to listeners to do their own research on that. But maybe my next guest will be able to shed light on both that and other dubious practices that may be occurring in other government institutions, such as the military. And he'll be talking about allegations of satanic practices. Douglas Dietrich is my next guest, as I mentioned. Douglas was a Department of Defense research librarian, and Mr. Dietrich was responsible for document destruction. He also became entangled in exposing child sexual abuse scandals. Douglas has appeared as a guest on shows such as Coast to Coast, Caravan to Midnight, and often controversial but never boring. I was delighted to have the chance to speak with him, and I'm going to split the show into two halves because we spoke at quite length. So today's show is part one. We'd originally intended to speak about zombies and vampires, but we talked about other stuff instead. We just sort of decided to see where the conversation would go. We'll talk about zombies and vampires on another show for sure. There is some colourful language in some bits, so I wanted just to warn you. Rather than editing everything out and beeping and stuff that, I just wanted to let you know, and if you know, if you do have children around, you might want to turn the sound down at some point, so that's just a warning. Without further ado, let's listen to what Douglas has to say. Hello, Douglas.
Hi, Mr. Sentinel. I'm really glad to be here with you. It's an honor to be here with your listenership on the Truth Sentinel program.
No, the honour is all ours to have you on as a guest. We really appreciate you taking the time to come and speak to us, because I know you've got a lot of information about lots of different subjects, and I know today we were going to sort of talk about zombies, vampires and voodoo, but we're also